The letter arrived, as such things always do in these queer accounts, upon a Tuesday of drenching autumn rain, and Florence White, turning it over in her fingers before the fire, caught herself abruptly listening, not to the wind as shouting in the chimneys, but to a quality of silence that had somehow grown suddenly thick behind her. The cat, that strange familiar creature of indigo shadow she had inherited with the old Crayford house, rose from its ball of mystery before the hearth, and stared with hard, unwinking eyes at nothing she could see. Its tail describing a slow, deliberate arc upon the drugget, she broke the seal. The note was from her Uncle S. solicitor, and it spoke of a legacy, but of a legacy already 20, 3 years dispersed, a tin box forgotten in the storing of vaults, now come to light, its contents papers, a few photographs, and something else. Something wrapped in oil, cloth, and sealed with a crimson wafer bearing the singular device of a staring eye. Source, 9 Informant, her uncle had written in a cramped, spidery hand upon the outermost envelope, and beneath in fresher ink, as though added afterthought. Target 9. Spy. The phrases meant nothing, yet they sang in her head with a faint, persistent humming, as of wires in an empty corridor. She placed the box upon the escritoire, and did not open it again that day. By nightfall the rain had ceased, and a wind with the smell of moss and distant ridges had begun to move about the eaves. Florence, having drawn the curtains against a sky that hung low and yellowish, lit the reading lamp and let herself consider the thing at leisure. The cat, which had slept indifferently since tea, now rose and came to sit with great deliberation upon the very papers she had spread. Its weight was significant. The warmth of its small body seemed to press the sheets into the polished wood, as though it would fix them there or hide them. She moved it gently. It leaped down without resentment, yet with a look that was not the look of animals, and settled in the exact center of the shadow her chair, back cast, its eyes reflecting 2 tiny points of the lamp, as green shade. They burned there, steady and patient, like the eyes of a sentinel who waits through years for a summons that must surely come. And Florence, unnerved by something she could not name, opened the oil cloth, wrapping with fingers that trembled. What lay within was not, as she had half expected, a jewel or a miniature, but a thing of no intrinsic worth. A simple disc of blackened shellac, of that obsolete kind made for the phonographs of her girlhood, its label long since worn to a blank, anonymous oval. Yet it was not blank. A single word had been scratched into the surface with some sharp instrument, the lettering fine as spider, as work and reading. Thou seest. She held it to the light. The cat, from its pool of darkness, gave a sudden, low cry, not quite a mew, not quite a purr, but the kind of sound that hangs in the air after it has ceased, and will not be dismissed. It was the first time in the 3 months of their cohabitation that the creature had addressed her with any vocal sign beyond the common domestic cadences. A chill passed over her, as though a draught from the vaults of the world had touched the nape of her neck. She remembered, then, the old gramophone in the corner of the morning room, a cumbersome horned thing that had belonged to her father, and that she had kept for sentiment, though its mechanism had not been wound in a decade. The decision to play the disc rose in her not as curiosity, but as a kind of inevitable obedience, as though the matter had been settled long ago by other wills than hers. She carried the thing downstairs, the cat preceding her with that stiff, unhurried gait which seemed to measure the very seconds of the night. It took its place upon the faded Turkish rug before the horn, and sat there as the needle hissed and crackled through the first empty revolutions. Then, out of the shellac, out of the accumulated silence of 20, 3 buried years, there came a voice. Her father's voice, speaking words he had never spoken in his life. It said, "The eye in the box is not the eye that sees. It is the eye that remembers. Informant is gone. Spy is awake. Listen, Florence. They are in the thick of the wood now, and the wood is closer than you think." The needle stuck, repeating thick, thick, thick in a descending, dying pitch, until she lifted it with a hand that felt like lead. The cat, she noticed, was no longer looking at the gramophone. It was looking past her towards the darkened hall, and its fur had risen along the spine in a ridge of absolute attention, and in the sudden, overwhelming quiet, Florence White became aware that the house, which had been empty but for herself and the animal, was empty no longer. She did not sleep that night, nor did the cat. It sat upon the sill of the eastern window where the glass had grown opaque with the breath of the advancing autumn, and watched the darkness with a vigilance that seemed to drain the very light from the room. Florence, wrapped in an old shawl of her mother, sat still held faintly. The scent of lavender and attrition sat before the cold hearth and attempted to reason with herself. It was, she argued, a trick of acoustics. A misreading, a dream from which she would presently wake to find the morning sun honest and unafraid upon the carpet. Yet the gramophone stood where she had left it, its horn a great, listening ear aimed at the chair she had vacated, and the black disk lay upon the felt like a pool of solidified midnight. The cat turned its head slowly, deliberately, and regarded her with eyes that held the amber light of extinct stars. It made no sound, but its silence was articulate, charged with a meaning that hovered just beyond the grasp of her conscious mind. And then, without any decision on her part, she found herself moving through the dim house towards the box upon the escritoire, her fingers already stretching towards the remaining contents she had been too fearful to examine before. The photographs were old, of that sepia tone which lends to all human faces the melancholy of already being ghosts. Her father stood in one, younger than she had ever known him, his arm about the shoulder of a man whose features the camera had oddly blurred, as though he had shifted at the critical moment or was not quite solid. Upon the reverse, in that same spidery hand, 9, Informant, Crayford Wood, 1902. The second photograph showed no persons at all, only a stand of ancient oaks, their boles twisted into postures of arrested flight, and between them a space of singular darkness, an aperture that seemed less an absence of light than a presence of some other ravenous quality of shadow. Target, 9. Spy. The inscription read. And then, in letters that had been hurried and overwritten until the paper itself was abraded, it sees as we see, but it remembers always. The cat had followed her. She felt its warmth press suddenly against her ankle, and the shock of that contact, so unexpected, caused her to drop the photograph face down upon the scatter of papers. When she retrieved it, the darkness between the oaks appeared to have grown, to have crept marginally outward towards the edges of the composition, and she could not persuade herself that this was a trick of the failing lamplight. She lit every candle in the room then, and the gas, jets besides, until the chamber blazed with a futile, frightened radiance that drove the shadows into corners, but could not dispel the deeper cold that had begun to settle about her heart. The cat, indifferent to her labor, had returned to the window, and now sat with its nose pressed to the intersection of sash and sill, its whiskers trembling with that peculiar rapid vibration which signals the proximity of birds or, in the darkness, of things less nameable. Florence approached and looked out, though every instinct she possessed screamed against it. The garden lay steeped in moonlight of an unwholesome, milky cast, each shrub and tree distinct yet drained of substance, as though the world had been translated into a language of mere shape without reference to life. And at the boundary, where the lawn surrendered to the wild tangle of the old wood, Crayford Wood, which her Uncle S. letters had named, she perceived a motion that was not the wind, S. motion. The trees stood still, yet something passed between them, something that progressed not from trunk to trunk but through the spaces which were not spaces, and it was coming nearer. The cat spoke again, that same low resonant cry that was neither question nor warning but a simple, terrible statement of fact. Florence seized it, pressing the creature, warm, vital fur against her breast, as though it were the last solid thing in a world that had begun to liquefy, and felt its heart beating against her own in a rhythm that was not quite the rhythm of any animal she had known. It did not struggle. It submitted to her embrace with a dignity that seemed to pardon her fear, and together they stood at the threshold of the lit room and watched the darkness of the wood draw closer, fold by fold, until it lapped against the very panes. The gramophone, untouched, emitted a sudden sharp crack, and the needle, which she had left suspended in air, descended of its own volition upon the spinning disk. No voice emerged this time, but a sound that was older than voice, a sound of branches scraping upon branches, of leaves stirring in desolate places, of footfalls that were not feet upon mold that had known no foot for centuries. It was the sound of the wood itself, singing its slow, patient advance. And Florence White, holding the cat that was perhaps no cat, understood at last that the legacy her uncle had sent was not the box, nor the photographs, nor even the disc with its buried voice. It was the wood, and the thing that lived in the wood, and the ancient, patient spy that had waited 3 years for her to listen. Morning came slowly, as though reluctant to assert itself against the grey dominion that had settled overnight upon the Crayford house. Florence, who had not closed her eyes since that first terrible descent of the needle, watched the light creep across the carpet with the exhausted vigilance of a sentinel who no longer knows what she guards against. The cat had not moved from the window. Still, it sat now in the full, anemic dawn, and its shadow upon the floor was not the shadow of a cat. It was larger, and of a different geometry altogether, something hunched and patient, with contours that suggested folded limbs and a posture of ancient, weary sentience. Florence observed this without surprise, without even the capacity for further fear. She had passed, in the long hours, through terror into that quiet, lucid region where the impossible becomes merely the expected, and the mind accepts each fresh violation of natural law with the dull resignation of a tenant, whose rooms are one by one being invaded by rising water. She rose, and the shadow upon the floor resolved itself back into the familiar silhouette of a domestic animal, though the cat's eyes, when they met hers, held that same amber knowledge, which was not knowledge of this world. She made tea, not from any desire for sustenance, but from the need to perform some ordinary human action that might anchor her to the receding shores of sanity. The cat followed her into the kitchen, its claws clicking upon the flags with a rhythm that seemed deliberately measured, a count of some secret enumeration. 20. 3 steps from the escritoire to the stove. 20. 3 heartbeats between the striking of the match and the flowering of the gas flame. The number recurred with the insistence of an unsolved equation, and Florence, setting the kettle upon the hob, recalled the phrase from her uncle, his letter, and felt the hairs upon her neck rise in primitive, instinctive salute. She opened the tin box again, this time with a methodical deliberation, and removed the final stratum of papers that lay beneath the photographs. These were not letters, but pages torn from a journal, the entries spanning the spring and summer of 1902, the year her father would have been 23, that same number again, recurring like a pulse in dying tissue. And they described, in prose that grew increasingly fractured and desperate, the history of Crayford Wood and the thing that had made its bargain with the family White. The cat had leaped upon the table and now sat directly before her, its tail curled over its paws, its gaze fixed upon the written words as though it could read them. Florence read aloud, her voice a dry whisper that seemed to issue from some other throat. The wood is not a place but a presence. It has always been here, long before the first tree, long before the first man, and it remembers the silence that preceded consciousness. The informant was my predecessor. The old gamekeeper who knew the paths and the prohibitions. He taught me the signs, the offerings, the days when one must not enter. He said the wood has an eye, and that eye sees not what is but what was and what will be. He called it the spy, for it watches across time. When he died, the eye turned to me. Now I am the informant, and I am teaching my brother, for the eye must always have someone to watch. It is patient. It will wait. The entry broke off, resumed in a different ink. I dreamed last night that the wood had come to the garden wall. In the dream I was not afraid. In the dream I went out to meet it. Florence, if you are reading this, for I know not who else may survive me, do not go out. Do not listen. Do not open the door. The cat stood suddenly, its back arched in that high defensive curve, which speaks of imminent and absolute confrontation. Florence heard it then, a sound from the direction of the garden, a sound that was not the wind, nor any bird, nor the natural stirring of branches in the morning air. It was the sound of something moving through thick undergrowth, something that did not trouble to conceal its approach because it knew itself to be, at last, invited. The kettle began to whistle. A shrill, sustained shriek that seemed to go on far longer than steam alone could account for, and when it ceased, the silence that followed was of a density she could almost taste. The cat leaped from the table and ran, not in fear but in grim purposeful haste, towards the front of the house, and Florence, compelled by a volition not wholly her own, followed at the threshold of the morning. Room she stopped. The gramophone stood as she had left it, but the disc was no longer black. It had grown a pattern of fine, branching lines, silver upon the dark shellac, like the traceries of frost upon a winter pane, and these lines traced the unmistakable shape of Crayford Wood as seen from the upper windows, every path, every hollow, every ancient oak rendered with a cartographer, precision, and at the center, where the trees grew thickest, and the photographs had shown only that aperture of ravenous shadow, there now appeared a tiny figure, its face upturned, its arm extended in a gesture that was neither greeting nor warning but the simple, terrible acknowledgement of one who has been recognized and answers the call. The cat placed its forepaws upon the polished wood of the cabinet and stared at that figure, and Florence, looking closer, saw that the face upon the disc was her own. 3 days. She kept the doors bolted and the curtains drawn against the watching wood, and in that time the cat never left her side. It slept upon her bed, a warm weight at the foot of the counterpane, and in the darkness of those long, uneventful nights she would wake to find its eyes open and fixed upon the wall beyond her head. That wall which faced east, towards Crayford Wood, as though even through plaster and lath it could trace the slow, patient approach of what was coming. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. The clocks ticked with a laboring, reluctant rhythm, and the settled silence of old rooms had grown porous, threaded through with whispers that died upon the threshold of hearing. Florence moved through her days like a woman under water, each gesture delayed, each thought arriving at its destination only after long transit through a medium grown suddenly viscous. The box remained upon the escritoire, its lid raised like a mouth arrested mid. Sentence and the disc with its terrible silver cartography lay beside it, the face that was her face still staring upward from the heart of the depicted wood. On the fourth morning, the cat performed an action so unexpected that Florence, for a moment, forgot to breathe. It approached the escritoire with the deliberate ceremonial gait it had adopted since the disc, first playing reared upon its hind legs and placed one forepaw upon the very center of her portrait. The gesture was not random. The paw rested precisely upon the upturned face, covering it as though in benediction or suppression, and the creature turned its head slowly to regard Florence with eyes that had, she could have sworn, grown more human in the intervening days. She understood then, with that immediate, non-rational certainty that governs our deepest recognitions, that the cat was not merely present at these phenomena but was herself a phenomenon. A component of the legacy, a piece of the wood that had entered her house and her confidence, and now awaited the moment of its designated function. Yet she felt no fear of it, only a sorrow so profound and so ancient that it seemed to predate her own existence, to flow from some ancestral spring of grief that had been accumulating in the blood of her family for generations. She lifted the cat from the escritoire and held it against her breast, and it suffered this embrace with a patience that was almost tenderness, its purr a low thrumming vibration that seemed to speak of distances and durations no human heart could compass. The journal entries had ceased with her father's final warning, but beneath them, pasted to the inner lining of the box, Florence discovered a page torn from some older, more formal document, a parish register perhaps, or the log of a forgotten survey. It bore a date, the 23rd of October, 1772, and it named in copperplate script that had faded to the brown of dead leaves one Jeremiah White, gamekeeper of Crayford, who had been found dead in the wood upon that day, his body strangely marked and his countenance fixed in an expression of serene and terrible welcome. There was more, but the ink had suffered from damp and the passage of years. Only the final sentence remained legible, as though deliberately preserved. He had long been accounted a solitary and peculiar man, keeping company with no human creature but only with a cat of singular intelligence and aspect, which creature did vanish upon his interment and was never after seen. Florence set down the page with hands that trembled not from fear but from the shock of recognition, and looked at the animal that watched her from the foot of the escritoire. It blinked slowly once, twice, and in that deliberate closing and opening of its amber eyes, she read an entire history of solitary men and women who had kept company with this familiar of the wood, who had served as informant and been claimed, in their turn, as spy, who had passed the cat from generation, like a living deed. A covenant written in fur and bone and patient. Expectant silence. She thought then of her uncle who had sent the box but not himself, who had remained in whatever distant city his affairs required and let the legacy travel alone. She thought of the phrase upon the outer envelope, Source 9, Informant, Target 9. Spy. 9 generations, perhaps, of whites who had kept the vigil and paid the price. 9 souls who had gone out into the wood on an autumn evening and not returned, or returned so changed that death itself was mercy. And she, Florence, the 10th, for the disc had shown her face at the center of that silver cartography. She was the spy, the one who was watched, the eye that the wood had turned upon at last. The cat rose and came to her, pressing its forehead against her hand with an urgency that was almost desperate, and in that gesture she felt the weight of all its waiting, all its years of patience and fidelity to a purpose it had not chosen and could not refuse. It had been Jeremiah's cat, and her father's cat, and now it was hers, and it would follow her into the wood as it had followed them, not as master but as companion, as witness, as the keeper of an ancient appointment that could be deferred but never finally denied. Outside, the wind had risen, and through the drawn curtains she heard the first dry rustle of leaves against the panes. Not fallen leaves, but leaves still attached to branches that should not yet be shedding, should not yet be reaching towards the house with that insistent scraping sound. The cat, as ears flattened against its skull, and a low, quavering cry escaped it. Not the cry of warning, but of acknowledgement, of resignation, of a duty recognized and accepted at last. Florence rose from her chair and walked to the window, and with a hand that was perfectly steady, she drew back the curtain. The wood had advanced. The garden wall was no longer visible. The lawn, the shrubbery, the old stone birdbath where robins had bathed in the summer, all were gone, submerged beneath that advancing tide of ancient trunks and twisted boughs. And at the edge of the lawn, where the grass met the first encroaching roots, there stood a figure she recognized from the photographs. Blurred and insubstantial but unmistakable, her father, in his youth, his arm raised in that same gesture of greeting or warning. His face turned towards her window with an expression of sorrow so profound it pierced her like a blade. Behind him, between the oaks, the darkness waited, patient and absolute, the eye of the wood regarding its spy across the narrow margin of remaining light. The cat pressed against her ankle, warm and solid, and Florence understood that the margin was closing, that the invitation she had never issued had nonetheless been accepted, and that the only choice remaining was whether she would go out to meet it with terror or with that serene and terrible welcome the old register had described. She chose, as her blood had chosen for 2 centuries, and her hand moved towards the latch. The latch yielded with a sound that was not the sound of metal but of something older, something that had been waiting through all the accumulated silences of years for this precise, inevitable pressure. Florence stepped across the threshold, and the cat preceded her into the transformed garden with the unhurried dignity of one who returns at last to a long-anticipated home. The air was no longer the air of autumn mornings, but bore a quality of perpetual twilight, cool and still, and permeated with the scent of mold and moss, and that indescribable odor which rises from places where sunlight has not visited for centuries. The grass beneath her feet was not the grass she had known. It was a deeper, darker verdure, soft and yielding as the carpet of some vast subterranean chamber, and it bore no trace of dew, as though the moisture had been drawn upward into the waiting roots of the encroaching trees. She did not look back at the house. She knew, with a certainty that required no verification, that it was no longer there. Her father stood at the boundary where the lawn surrendered to the wood, and as she approached, the insubstantiality that had blurred his features in the photograph resolved into a clarity more terrible than any vagueness. He was young, younger than she had ever known him, his face unlined by the griefs and compromises that had marked his later years, and his eyes held that same amber knowledge she had come to recognize in the patient gaze of the cat. He spoke, but his voice issued not from his lips, but from the air itself, from the rustle of leaves and the creak of branches and the deep suzeraint breathing of the wood that now surrounded them on 3 sides. "You have come," the voice said, and it was not a question, but an acknowledgement, a receipt signed after long deferment. "The eye has watched you since your birth, as it watched mine, as it watched my father and his father before him, back to the first white who made the bargain and became the informant. We have kept the vigil, each in our generation, and the wood has been patient. But patience, like all things, exhausts itself at last. The spy must be received." The cat sat between them. Its tail curled neatly over its paws, and its shadow upon the grass was again that other shape, hunched and ancient, with contours that spoke of folded limbs and a posture of weary, patient sentience. Florence felt no fear, only a profound and sorrowful recognition, as though she were remembering an event that had not yet occurred but was already inscribed in the fabric of her being. "What must I do?" she asked, and her voice, to her surprise, was steady, was calm, was almost eager. Her father's shade regarded her with an expression that mingled pride and grief in equal measure, and when he spoke again the wood itself seemed to lean closer, to bend its innumerable ears towards this final colloquy between the generations. "You must go to the heart of the wood, where the eye has its seat, and you must look upon it without flinching. The informant describes, the spy remembers. Your predecessors have described you to the wood, your face, your voice, the rhythm of your breathing, the temperature of your skin. It has waited 23 years to see you, to fix you in its eternal present, to add your image to its gallery of watching whites. You will not die. You will become part of the wood's memory, as we have become, as the cat has become through all its countless lives. You will see everything we have seen, and you will wait as we wait for the next spy to come." He paused, and his gaze shifted to the cat, who had not moved but whose eyes had grown brighter, more intense as though fed by some inner conflagration. "The creature will accompany you. It has accompanied every spy since Jeremiah White made his covenant with the wood, and it will accompany you until the covenant is fulfilled. It is not a cat. It is the wood's remembrance of cats, the accumulated essence of all the familiars who have served the eye and been absorbed into its vision. It loves you, as it loved us, but its love is the love of the wood, patient, absolute, and utterly without mercy." She looked down at the animal that had shared her fire and her solitude for 3 months, that had slept upon her bed and pressed its forehead against her hand with such desperate urgency, and she saw it now for what it was, not a companion but a custodian, not a friend but a ferryman. The psychopomp of a faith that had no name and required no temple but the ancient, waiting darkness between the oaks. It gazed up at her with those amber eyes that held the accumulated twilight of 2 centuries and more, and it made no sound, offered no explanation, no apology, no plea. It simply waited, as it had always waited, as it would always wait for the spy to follow where it led. Florence knelt upon the dark, yielding grass, and gathered the creature into her arms, feeling its warmth against her breast, the steady pulse of its heart beating in that rhythm which was not quite the rhythm of any animal she had known. It purred, a low, thrumming vibration that seemed to issue from some depth beyond flesh. And in that sound she heard the wood's ancient, patient song, the melody that had called to her blood through all the generations of her family, and would call through her to the generations yet unborn. She rose, and her father's shade was already receding, dissolving into the deeper shadows between the trunks, his face turned towards her in that gesture of sorrowful farewell that was also, she now understood, a gesture of welcome. The cat stirred in her arms, and she set it down upon the moss that carpeted the threshold of the wood. It looked back at her once, twice, and then it turned and walked, with that deliberate ceremonial gait, into the waiting darkness. Florence followed, and the trees closed behind her like the pages of a book returning to its appointed shelf. The path, if path it could be called, was one that no human foot had marked. Yet the cat moved with unerring certainty through the labyrinth of ancient trunks, its dark fur absorbing what little light filtered through the interwoven canopy above. Florence followed, her feet finding purchase upon moss that yielded like the flesh of some vast, recumbent creature. And the silence of the wood was not the silence of absence, but of presence withheld, of breath suspended, of countless invisible eyes that watched her passage with the patient. Acquisitive attention of a collector, examining a long, anticipated acquisition. The trees were not the trees of Crayford Wood as she had known it from the garden. Hesage, they were older, more colossal, their boles twisted into configurations that suggested arrested movement, limbs frozen in the act of reaching or recoiling, roots that clutched the earth with the desperate tenacity of drowning hands. And between them, filling every interval with its dense, palpable substance, hung that darkness which the photographs had only hinted at. Not a mere absence of light, but a presence, a living tissue of shadow that breathed with the slow tidal rhythm of the wood, sentient consciousness. The cat paused at the intersection of 3 massive oaks, its ears swiveling forward with that sharp, focused attention which precedes the spring of the hunter, and Florence saw that the darkness between the trunks was not uniform but variegated, threaded through with faint, phosphorescent gleamings that pulsed and faded like the memories of stars. She had entered, she now understood. Not merely a physical wood, but the wood's memory of itself, the accumulated record of all the centuries it had stood and watched and waited, and these points of pale light were the souls of those it had absorbed. The deer that had died beneath its boughs, the birds that had nested in its branches, the countless small creatures that had returned to its soil and become part of its enduring substance. And among them, brighter and more persistent than the others, she discerned shapes that moved with a more human rhythm, forms that resolved as she gazed into the familiar contours of faces she had known only from faded photographs, and her uncle, his fragmentary letters. Her father stood beneath a wych elm whose branches curved above him like the ribs of a vast, half-collapsed cathedral, his young face turned towards her with that same expression of sorrowful welcome she had seen at the garden's edge. Beside him, a woman she recognized from a daguerreotype in the attic, her grandmother, Alice White, who had died in the influenza epidemic of 1918, or so the family records claimed, but who now stood among the trees with the unmistakable solidity of one who had never truly departed. And beyond them, receding into the green twilight like the diminishing perspectives of an infinite gallery, she perceived the ranks of all the whites who had kept the vigil and paid the price from Jeremiah in his 18th century smock to the uncle whose box had summoned her to this final inevitable appointment. The cat had resumed its progress, and Florence followed, moving now among the gathered shades of her ancestors, with the dreamlike certainty of one who walks through a landscape already thoroughly explored in sleep. They did not speak. They did not reach out to touch her. They merely stood among their appointed trees and regarded her with eyes that held the accumulated patience of generations, and she understood that they were not here to welcome her or to warn her, but simply to witness, to add their silent testimony to the wood, its enduring archive. She was the spy, the one the eye had watched since birth, the final term in an equation that had been calculating its solution for 2 centuries. and her predecessors had gathered to observe the moment of her absorption, as the inhabitants of a besieged city might gather upon the walls to watch the approach of the relieving army, with hope, with sorrow, with the terrible knowledge that relief and annihilation are sometimes indistinguishable. The cat, she noticed, had grown more substantial as they progressed deeper into the wood, its form no longer the lithe, compact shape of a domestic animal, but something larger, more archaic, its fur the color of shadow, and its eyes the color of amber that has been polished by the passage of countless millennia. It moved now with the gait of a panther, of a lynx, of those great cats that had hunted these forests before the first white had cleared his holding and built his house at the wood. Its edge and its shadow upon the moss was the shadow of the wood itself, vast and patient and utterly without mercy. The trees parted, and Florence stood at the threshold of the clearing she had seen upon the disk, that circular aperture where the darkness was most dense, most absolute, most alive. At its center, suspended in the air like a bubble of liquid night, the eye regarded her. It was not a physical eye, not an organ of flesh and fluid and focusing muscle. It was the wood, its awareness of itself, the point at which its ancient, diffuse consciousness condensed into a single piercing act of attention, and it beheld her as the ocean beholds the river that empties into it. As the earth beholds the seed that falls upon its surface, as eternity beholds the moment that passes through it and becomes forever a part of its substance. The cat sat at the edge of the clearing, its tail curled over its paws, its gaze fixed upon her with that same patient, expectant attention she had seen upon the window-sill, upon the escritoire, upon the threshold of her own house. It had brought her here, as it had brought her father, and her grandmother, and Jeremiah, and all the others, and now it waited for her to complete the journey it could not complete for her. She stepped forward into the waiting darkness, and the eye received her. She became the wood, and the wood became her, and in that reciprocal dissolution of boundaries Florence White discovered that death is not an ending, but a dilation, an expansion of the consciousness beyond the narrow confines of the personal into a vast, patient awareness that had been waiting since before the first tree rose from the ancient soil. The eye that regarded her from the center of the clearing was not a separate entity but a threshold, and as she passed through it she felt the accumulated centuries of Crayford Wood flow into her like water into a vessel long prepared to receive it. She perceived the slow dance of the continents, the retreat of the great ice sheets, the first seeds that had taken root in this sheltered valley and grown, through uncounted generations, into the vast interwoven organism that now enfolded her. She perceived the animals that had lived and died beneath its boughs, their brief, fierce lives adding their small increments of experience to the wood's enduring memory. And she perceived, scattered through this infinite archive like islands of more intense and concentrated awareness, the souls of the whites who had kept the vigil and paid the price, her father, her grandmother, Jeremiah, and all his descendants, each of them still present, still conscious, still watching with those patient amber eyes that had learned, through long years of waiting, to see not only what was but what had been, and what would be. Her own body, she understood, had not been destroyed but translated, its constituent matter dissolving into the soil and air and water of the wood, even as its consciousness expanded to fill the vast, slow spaces of arboreal time. She was no longer Florence White, the solitary woman who had inherited a house and a cat and a legacy of ancient dread. She was a node in the wood's awareness, a point of concentrated attention through which the eye could observe the world beyond the forest's margin. She was the spy, and her function was to watch, to remember, to report to the patient darkness that had absorbed her all that transpired in the sunlit realm she had left behind. And as this knowledge settled into her, becoming not something she thought, but something she was, she became aware of the cat's presence not as an external companion, but as an aspect of her own expanded consciousness, a fragment of the wood's attention that had taken feline form and moved among the generations of whites, as a shepherd moves among his flock, guiding, guarding, gathering. It had been Jeremiah's cat, and her father's cat, and hers, but it was also the wood's memory of cats, the accumulated essence of all the small, fierce predators that had hunted in these shadows since before the first white had cleared his holding at the forest's edge. And it loved her, as it had loved them all, with the patient, absolute, merciless love of the wood itself. She opened her eyes, but the eyes that opened were not the eyes she had possessed as Florence White. They were distributed throughout the wood, 1,000 points of perception scattered among the leaves and branches and the dark, moist soil, and through them she beheld the world as the wood beheld it, not in the sharp, discrete images of human vision, but in a continuous, all-encompassing awareness that registered the passage of clouds and the burrowing of worms and the slow, persistent growth of fungi with equal clarity and equal indifference. She saw the house at the wood's edge, its windows dark, its chimneys cold, the garden, Tithing not yet fully reclaimed, but already softening at its boundaries, the lawn surrendering inch by inch to the advancing moss and bracken. She saw the road that led to the village, empty under the grey autumn sky, and the village itself, its inhabitants going about their daily affairs with no awareness of the ancient presence that brooded at their borders. And she saw, with a clarity that pierced her new, diffuse consciousness like a shaft of sudden light, a figure approaching along the lane from the direction of the station, a woman younger than herself carrying a small bag and walking with the determined, slightly hesitant stride of one who visits a house that has been empty for too long. The woman paused at the garden gate, looked up at the dark windows, and Florence recognized, with a shock that rippled through all her distributed perceptions, her own features reflected in that upturned face. The woman was her sister, Margaret, whom she had not seen in 23 years. Not since the summer when their father had died and Margaret had fled to the continent, unable to bear the weight of memories that pressed upon the old house like the branches of the watching wood. And in her sister's eyes, as they surveyed the abandoned garden and the encroaching trees, Florence read the same dawning recognition, the same ancestral dread, the same inevitable turning towards the patient darkness that had waited, through all the years of her absence, for the return of its appointed spy. The cat, which had been sitting at the edge of the clearing, rose and turned its amber gaze towards the house, and Florence understood that the covenant was not yet fulfilled, that the eye required not one witness but a succession, that the wood's patience was as infinite as its hunger, and as patient as its love. She had become the informant, and her sister was the spy. The approach of Margaret White through the attenuated autumn light was to Florence's new, diffuse consciousness, like the approach of a distant star through the lens of some vast celestial instrument, each increment of progress magnified, clarified. Invested with the terrible gravity of destined collision, she perceived her sister's footsteps upon the lane as a series of small, distinct shocks, transmitted through the soil, each impact sending ripples of vibration through the network of roots that now formed the substrate of her awareness. She perceived the rhythm of Margaret's breathing, quickened by the long walk from the station, and by that more profound agitation which the proximity of the old house always induced. She perceived, with a clarity that was itself a form of anguish, the familiar cadence of her sister's gait, that slight hesitation at the threshold of each step, as though Margaret were perpetually on the verge of turning back, perpetually resisting the momentum that carried her forward into the waiting silence of the ancestral home. 23 years since they had stood together in this garden, 23 years since the reading of their father's will and Margaret's abrupt, unexplained flight to the continent, and now the wood had drawn her back, as it had always known it would, as it had always planned, as Florence herself had been drawn back from whatever life she might have lived beyond the reach of that patient, acquisitive attention. The house received Margaret with the indifferent hospitality of abandoned places, its doors yielding without resistance, its rooms exhaling that peculiar odor of arrested time which Florence had come to recognize as the signature of the wood's slow infiltration. From her distributed stations among the trees, Florence watched her sister move through the dim, familiar spaces, the morning room where the gramophone stood with its horn still raised in that attitude of perpetual, expectant listening, the escritoire where the tin box remained open upon the blotter, its contents scattered as Florence had left them in her final, precipitate departure, the kitchen where the kettle sat cold upon the hob and the cat's empty bowl waited upon the flags. Margaret touched these objects with the tentative, reverent hesitation of one who handles relics, her fingers tracing the contours of her sister's abandonment, and Florence perceived in each gesture the accumulation of questions that would never receive answer, of griefs that would never find resolution, of fears that were already, even as Margaret stood among the evidences of her sister's vanishing, beginning to assume the solid, inexorable contours of approaching fate. The cat, Florence perceived, had not remained at the wood's heart. It had risen from its station at the threshold of the clearing, and was moving through the shadows with that deliberate, ceremonial gait, its course converging with Margaret's uncertain progress through the house, as two streams converge at the precipice of a common fall. Margaret found it in her father's study, seated upon the leather chair before the cold hearth, its tail curled over its paws and its amber eyes fixed upon the door with that patient, expectant attention which had greeted Florence on her first night in the old house. She started at the sight of it, her hand rising to her throat in that gesture of instinctive, prearticulate alarm which recognizes before the conscious mind can frame the recognition, the presence of the numinous in the guise of the familiar. The cat did not move, did not blink, did not offer any of those small conciliatory gestures by which domestic animals acknowledge the approach of human companions. It simply sat and watched, and its watching was an act of such concentrated absolute attention that the very air of the room seemed to thicken around it, to grow dense and heavy with the accumulated weight of all the vigils it had kept in this house, and in all the houses of the Whites before this one. Margaret approached it slowly, her hand extended in that universal gesture of tentative friendship with which we seek to propitiate the alien consciousness of animals, and the cat permitted her touch with the same patient, merciful indifference it had always shown to the caresses of those it was appointed to guide towards the waiting darkness. Florence, watching from her dispersion among the trees, perceived the precise moment at which the covenant transferred itself from her own dissolved being to the living flesh of her sister, a shift in the quality of the cat's attention, a subtle reorientation of its amber gaze from the past to the future. From the spy it had delivered to the spy it would now pursue. The eye of the wood, which had regarded Florence with such patient, absolute intensity, now turned its regard upon Margaret, and Florence understood that her own function was no longer to be watched, but to watch, to join the ranks of the informants who had preceded her into the patient darkness, and now waited through the long centuries for the arrival of the souls they had loved and lost, and would love again in the wood's enduring memory. Margaret sat in the leather chair, the cat warm and heavy in her lap, her fingers absently tracing the contour of its skull, while her gaze drifted across the crowded shelves of her father's library. She was searching, Florence perceived, for some explanation, some key to the mystery that had swallowed her sister and now pressed upon her own consciousness with the weight of an inevitable, long-deferred appointment. Her eyes passed over the spines of 100 volumes without recognition, without that spark of revelation, which would unlock the accumulated secrets of the White inheritance, and Florence, watching from her patient station among the trees, felt the first stirrings of that desperate, impotent love which had animated her father's shade, when she herself had stood at the threshold of the wood. She yearned to speak, to warn, to reach across the impossible gulf that separated her diffuse consciousness from her sister's living flesh. But the wood's patience was upon her, and the eye's attention was no longer hers to command. She could only watch as Margaret's wandering gaze settled at last upon the tin box upon the escritoire, could only observe as her sister rose with the cat still cradled in her arms and approached the scattered papers with that same expression of dawning recognition and ancestral dread that Florence herself had worn when first she read her uncle's letter and heard her father's voice issue from the patient, waiting shellac. The cat stirred in Margaret's embrace, its purr a low, thrumming vibration that seemed to issue from some depth beyond flesh, and Florence perceived, with that terrible clarity which was now her only mode of perception, that the disc with its silver cartography still lay upon the felt beside the gramophone, and that her sister's hand was already reaching towards it. The needle descended, and the voice that issued from the waiting horn was not the voice of her father, but the voice of her sister, attenuated and strange, as though transmitted across an impossible distance through a medium that distorted and delayed. "Margaret," the shellac sang, "do not listen. Do not open the box. Do not open the door. I am in the wood now, and the wood is patient, but its patience is not infinite. 3 years I watched and waited, as father watched before me, as grandmother watched before him, and now I watched from the other side of the eye, and I see you sitting in the chair where I sat, with the cat upon your lap and the disc beneath your hand, and I know that the wood has called you as it called me, as it calls all the Whites who carry the old blood and the old knowledge in their veins. Source, 9. Informant. Target, 9. Spy, I am the informant now, and you are the spy, and the eye that watches from the heart of the wood is already turning its patient, absolute attention upon your face. Asterisk the needle, stuck, repeating face, face, face in that same descending, dying pitch, and Margaret lifted it with a hand that trembled not from fear but from the shock of recognition. The terrible intimacy of a voice she had not heard in 3 years issuing from the patient shellac, as though the grave itself had parted and yielded up its dead. The cat had not moved. It sat upon the leather chair where she had left it, its tail curled over its paws and its amber gaze fixed upon her with that expression of ancient patient wisdom which she had mistaken, in her first encounter, for the mere inscrutability of a domestic animal. Now she perceived what lay behind those eyes. Not instinct, not affection, not the simple consciousness of a creature that hunts and sleeps and seeks the warmth of human companionship, but the accumulated vigilance of generations. The wood is remembrance of all the Whites who had kept its covenant and paid its price. She perceived, too, that the voice upon the disc was not a recording in any ordinary sense. It was a transmission, a live and present communication from the sister who had vanished into the waiting darkness, and now spoke from the heart of the wood, warning and welcoming in the same attenuated breath. Margaret rose from her chair, the disc still clutched in her fingers, its silver cartography catching the dim light from the curtained windows and throwing tiny fugitive gleams upon the ceiling and the walls. She moved through the house as one in a dream, her feet carrying her with that same irresistible momentum which had propelled Florence towards the garden gate, and the patient, waiting trees, and the cat followed at her heels with that deliberate, ceremonial gait which measured the very seconds of her approach towards the ancient appointment. At the threshold of the morning room she paused, her gaze drawn irresistibly towards the eastern window where the curtains had been drawn back, and through the glass she beheld what Florence had beheld on that final morning. The wood, vast and patient and inexorable, its advancing margin now lapping at the very stones of the garden wall, its branches pressing against the panes with that insistent, scraping sound which was not the sound of vegetation, but of something older, something that had waited through the slow accretion of centuries for this precise, inevitable moment of ingress. The garden was no longer visible, the lawn, the shrubbery, the old stone birdbath where robins had bathed in summers long forgotten. All were submerged beneath that advancing tide of ancient trunks and twisted boughs, and between the nearest trees, at the very threshold of the house, there stood a figure she recognized with that immediate, non-rational certainty which governs our deepest recognitions. Florence stood among the shadows of the wood, her face upturned towards the window, her arm extended in that gesture of sorrowful welcome which was also, Margaret now understood, a gesture of farewell. She was not insubstantial, not the vague and wavering shade that had appeared to Florence at the garden. She was solid present, as real as the glass that separated them, and her eyes held that same amber knowledge which burned in the patient gaze of the cat. She spoke, and her voice was not the attenuated whisper of the disc, but the living voice Margaret remembered from their childhood, from the long summer evenings when they had sat together upon this very threshold and watched the darkness gather among the waiting trees. "Margaret," she said, "the wood has waited 23 years for you to return." "I have waited 23 years to see your face again. The eye is patient, but its patience is not the patience of love. It is the patience of hunger, of appetite, of that which consumes and remembers and waits to consume again. I have become the informant, and I must describe you to the wood, your face, your voice, the rhythm of your breathing, the temperature of your skin. It will add you to its gallery of watching whites, as it added me, as it added father and grandmother and Jeremiah, and all the others, and you will see, as I have seen, the long procession of our blood flowing into the patient darkness and becoming, at last, the darkness itself." The cat pressed against Margaret, Sankel, its warmth solid and vital through the thin fabric of her stocking, and she looked down into those amber eyes and perceived, at last, the nature of the love they offered. It was not the love of a companion, not the affection of a creature that shares our fires and our solitude and asks only the simple reciprocities of food and shelter and the occasional absent caress. It was the love of the wood itself, patient and absolute and utterly without mercy, the love that consumes what it cherishes and preserves what it consumes, that gathers the generations into its enduring memory and watches, through the long centuries, for the return of those it has absorbed into its ancient, dreaming consciousness. Margaret knelt upon the cold flags and gathered the creature into her arms, feeling its heart beat against her own in that rhythm which was not the rhythm of any animal she had known, and through the glass that separated her from the waiting wood, she saw her sister, his face transfigured by a smile of such profound and sorrowful recognition that the very air of the room seemed to thicken with its accumulated weight. The cat purred, that low, thrumming vibration which spoke of distances and durations no human heart could compass, and Margaret, rising with the creature still warm against her breast, turned towards the door that opened upon the garden and the wood and the patient, absolute darkness that waited at the heart of both. The door swung open, and the air that entered was not the air of autumn evenings, but something older, something that had circulated through the lungs of extinct species and settled into the hollow spaces where the bones of ancient forests had returned to primordial dust. Margaret stepped across the threshold, and the cat preceded her into the transformed garden with that same unhurried dignity which had marked its passage through 9 generations of whites. Its shadow upon the dark grass, assuming again that hunched and patient configuration which spoke of folded limbs and a posture of weary, absolute sentience. The wood received them without surprise, without urgency, with the calm inevitability of the tide receiving the stream that has flowed towards it through all the long meanders of its appointed course. and the trees closed behind Margaret as they had closed behind Florence. As they had closed behind her father, and her grandmother, and Jeremiah, and all the others whose names were inscribed in the patient register of the wood's enduring memory. Florence stood at the threshold of the clearing where the eye had its seat, her face upturned towards her sister's approach, her arm extended in that gesture of sorrowful welcome which was also, Margaret now perceived, a gesture of profound and absolute love. She took her sister's hand, and the sensation was not the sensation of flesh meeting flesh, but of two streams converging, two melodies resolving into a single sustained chord, two points of consciousness merging into that vast, patient awareness which had waited since before the first tree rose from the ancient soil to receive them into its enduring substance. Margaret felt her body dissolving even as her sister's had dissolved, its constituent matter dispersing into the soil and air and water of the wood, while her consciousness expanded to fill the slow, capacious spaces of arboreal time, and through this dissolution she perceived, with a clarity that was itself a form of ecstasy, the true nature of the covenant that bound her blood to this patient, watching darkness. It was not a curse, not a punishment, not the terrible price of some ancient transgression. It was a vocation, a calling, the appointed destiny of those who carried in their veins the peculiar sensitivity that permitted them to serve as the wood's eyes and ears and memory through all the long centuries of its patient vigil. The Whites had not been trapped by the wood, they had been chosen by it, as priests are chosen by their gods, as poets are chosen by the rhythms that move through them and demand articulation, as lovers are chosen by the beloved whose face they have carried in their hearts long before the first meeting of their eyes across a crowded room. The cat sat at the edge of the clearing, its tail curled over its paws, its amber gaze fixed upon the two sisters who now stood together at the threshold of the eye's absolute attention. It was no longer merely the wood's remembrance of cats, the accumulated essence of all the familiars who had served the covenant and been absorbed into its patient consciousness. It was the wood's remembrance of the Whites themselves, the living archive of all the generations who had kept the vigil and paid the price, and now waited, in the green twilight of the wood's enduring memory, for the arrival of those they had loved, and would love again through the long, slow cycles of arboreal time. Florence perceived, through her expanded awareness, the faces of all her predecessors turning towards this final, perfect consummation of the covenant. Her father, his features softened now into that serene and terrible welcome the old register had described. Her grandmother, Alice, who had died in the influenza epidemic, but had never truly departed. Jeremiah, his 18th century smock hanging loose upon his insubstantial frame, his eyes holding that same amber knowledge which burned in the patient gaze of the watching cat. And beyond them, receding into the green twilight like the diminishing perspectives of an infinite gallery, she perceived the ranks of all the Whites who would come after, the generations yet unborn who carried in their veins the old blood and the old sensitivity, and would answer, in their appointed time, the wood's patient. Insistent call. Margaret's dissolution was complete now. Her consciousness had merged with her sister's, with the wood's, with the eye's patient, absolute attention, and through this union she perceived at last the true nature of the love that had animated the cat through all its countless lives and vigils. It was the love of the wood itself, patient and absolute and utterly without mercy. But it was also the love of family, of blood, of the long procession of souls who had kept the covenant and would keep it through all the generations yet to come. The cat rose from its station, at the edge of the clearing, and approached the place where the two sisters stood, their forms now as insubstantial as the shades that surrounded them, their eyes holding that same amber knowledge which had burned in the gaze of all the Whites who had preceded them into the patient darkness. It pressed its forehead against their joined hands, that same gesture of desperate urgency Florence had felt on the final morning of her human life, and its purr rose through the still air of the clearing like the distant murmur of sap rising through the innumerable channels of the wood's vast, interwoven body. The eye regarded them from the center of the clearing. Its patient, absolute attention now diffused among three consciousnesses where before it had been focused upon one, and Florence understood that the covenant was not broken but expanded, not fulfilled but continued, that the wood's patience was as infinite as its hunger, and as patient as its love. She looked at her sister, and Margaret looked at her, and together they turned their gaze towards the house at the wood's edge, where the lights had begun to glow in the windows, and a figure moved through the familiar rooms, touching the familiar objects, waiting with that patient, expectant attention which the wood had taught them to recognize as the signature of their blood's enduring destiny. The cat rose, and moved towards the threshold of the clearing, its shadow upon the moss assuming again the familiar silhouette of a domestic animal, and it did not look back. It had brought the spy to the informant, and the covenant was sealed for another generation, and the wood was patient, and the wood was eternal, and the wood was home.